My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to join you on a sunny Friday at the beginning of May. Uh, One of my favorite baseball announcers used to say, "It's the beginning of May, it's time to go outside." So, thank you for staying inside and joining us for the virtual reading group, and happy to be here with you. We are, as you know, reading The Life of the Mind. Exploring this new critical edition of The Life of the Mind that just came out. And we are in the midst of part one of The Life of the Mind, which is on thinking, divided into 4 chapters, in which Arendt is asking about the place and meaning of thinking. Um, she's not going to ask why we think. We'll get there today because she doesn't think there's an answer to that. Because if we were to answer the question why we think, there would have to be some end to thinking, some goal of thinking. Um, and that would mean that thinking has an outcome, some usefulness to it. And she doesn't think that's the case. At the same token, if you remember the very beginning of this book, The Life of the Mind, the introduction, she does say that there were 2 reasons that she writes this book, and one of them was her experience with the trial of Adolf Eichmann, in which she saw something in Eichmann. She saw his, as she describes it, inability to think, his thoughtlessness. And she wondered, hypothesized, speculated, could this inability to think, the fact that he spoke in cliches and thus didn't say anything of substance, that he just repeated what he heard, the fact that he uh simply couldn't express anything outside of bureaucratic language, um that he um protected himself from reality in extraordinary ways. This thoughtlessness, as she describes it, could it be that which allowed him to be um, an unwitting uh, participant in one of the greatest uh, activities of evil in the history of the world? And so she is wondering, right? That's why she writes this book, to what extent thinking might have an impact. Um, Maybe it's important. Um, and so could there be some end to thinking, some goal, which would actually have a use? Uh, I I don't know how that happened. How long was I muted for?
Just for a second, Roger. I don't know why you got muted.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Uh, Not sure where I was, but um,
Just like 2 sentences.
okay. In any case, she does wonder whether thinking has some use, in the sense of, could it be that which uh, allows us to not do evil? And yet, here in this chapter, we're going to be reminded again, as we have over and over in this text, um, that thinking has nothing to do with truth. That thinking, that we can't ask why man thinks, um, because to ask the question of why man thinks would to assume that there's some goal or end that we get to, and so we're going to be stuck in this somewhat difficult contradiction that she's going to put us in. and that we need to think ourselves through. Um, just to remind ourselves where we are, right? Uh, Arendt writes a lot about thinking in her life. Um, at times, she talks about thinking as this two in one, this conversation that I have with myself. At times, she compares thinking to like a stingray that makes me stop and think. Um, she sometimes talks about uh, thinking as this enlarged thinking, this letting my mind go wandering and being in conversation with other people and other perspectives around the world. These are all different ways that Arendt at times talks about thinking. Um, in this particular section of the book, at the end of chapter 2, which is called Thinking in the World of Appearances, um, Arendt is interested in, I'm sorry, chapter 2, which is called Mental Activities in a World of Appearances, but thinking as the mental activity that we're most interested in. Um, uh, she's interested in um, uh, thinking poetically, thinking through metaphors. Um, Thinking, she says, is one of the mental experiences, right? One of the mental activities uh, by which we humans distinguish ourselves. We are the rational animal or the thinking animal. Um, the three that she's going to deal with in this book are thinking, willing, and judging. And what they all share, one of the things they all share, is that they withdraw from the world. When you think, you separate yourself from the world. When you judge, you stand apart from the world. Right? When you will, you think about something that's not here. You stand apart from the world. Um, and yet, all of us, insofar as we are humans, beings, even if we think, will, and judge, we are still in the world and of the world. And so the problem that we got caught up on early on in this book was what she called the two world theory, right? This idea that on the that even though we are bodily people who appear in the world, and all things living things have an urge to appear, she says, we also imagine ourselves to be a thinking ego, a thinking person that stands outside of the world. And that this thinking ego, right, which is abstract, right? I say who I am, a thinking ego. I don't have a body, I don't have a gender or a race or a nationality or an age. I'm timeless, sexless, raceless. And we all know, this idea that there's sort of like some thinking ego in us, like an AI, a generative AI that is, you know, pure brain power, pure reason, um, and separate from anything that appears in the world. And she says this is clearly a fallacy, right? It's clearly the case that there is no such thing. All of us are bodied, sexed, gendered, etc. And yet she says it's not a deceptive fallacy or a dogmatic fallacy. It's an authentic fallacy, an authentic semblance, because it's a semblance we can't do without as humans, because we humans are thinking beings, and we think about things like justice and courage and truth, which are not worldly sensible, or not sensible things. You can't see justice. You can't see truth. You can't see courage. You can see an example of it, but you can't see it. And yet these thought words, as she calls them, which don't come from our senses, are, she thinks, indispensable to human being. Um, and and this raises a question for her, which is, how can we both be thinking beings who think about things that have no sensible apparatus, and also, and thus be separate from the world, and also be at home in the world? How can we be both? And she takes this utterly seriously, right? She says, look, thinking frees us from reality. it frees us from the real world of common sense. Um, and as a result, she says, we sort of are homeless when we think. Um, and yet we are also in the world. And that's the sort of fundamental tension that she's driving at. Thinking, she says, is so free that what it does is it desenses us and desensitizes us in the sense that um we can, in thinking, we can sort of think anything. We can think things that we've never seen. We can think things like a circle, which we've never seen, or a triangle. We've seen approximations, but we've never seen an exact one. We can think a unicorn. We can think a laughing triangle, right? To use an example, we can pray. We've never seen a, you know, we've never seen prayer. We've seen people praying, but we pray. And she says, these things, these thinking things, are so free, they radically withdraw from the world. And as this radical withdrawal, um, they are opposed to doing or acting. And the thinker is more like a spectator, one who looks at the world and sees it from afar and sees the hidden truths of the world, not truths, the hidden unity of the world. Um, and in this way, the thinker is the one who can either be at home in the darkness of non-being, right? The non-being of the real world, or if you're Plato or Socrates, you can be at home in the sun of ideas. You can so withdraw yourself from the world that you see the truth, the ideas, the sun out of the cave. Um, okay, well, that raises a question. How do we think ideas, whether it's truth or justice or beauty? How do we think these things? And she says, well, we can only think in language. We can't think of outside language, right? Um, you know, try and think about truth, and what comes into your head. It's going to be images, right? It may be Plato or Socrates or a circle or who knows what. Or think about courage, and it may be Achilles or Martin Luther King. These ideas are going to come into your head in language. You can't think those things without words or concepts in some way. And that's important. You can't think about language. And yet, language, if it's going to be free, like thinking is, can't just think things we've seen. It has to think, she says, in metaphor. Metaphor is what connects the world of appearances to the invisible world, and also what connects the invisible world of thought back into the world of appearances. Um, and so thinking needs language, but language is only adequate to thinking insofar as it's metaphor. And it's this metaphor which gives actuality or reality to abstract thought. Um, this metaphor, she thinks, is poetic in origin, right? And she turns us back to Homer as, at least in her telling, the origin of poetry and metaphor. Um, you know, Homer talks about the lines of the army coming at you like the lines of waves in a sea thrashing upon the shores, right? Um, uh, in this sense, metaphor turns us back to the sensual world. Um, the Cartesian idea of two worlds, right? This idea of a world of my mind and a world of my body, is a delusion, but it's, as she says, a plausible delusion. Um, and she says and even though it's an authentic semblance, there are not two worlds in the end because metaphor reconnects them. Metaphor unites them. And so our thought, which seems to be this authentic semblance that is separate from the world and homeless and timeless and spaceless, is brought back into the world through metaphors. Um, Walter Benjamin, right? Who is someone obviously who was a close friend of hers for many years, especially during their time together in 1930s in Paris. and who died in 1940 trying to escape the Nazis. Um, for, she sees Walter Benjamin as one of the great examples of a poetic thinker. Um, and in writing about Benjamin, she says that for Benjamin, a metaphor establishes a connection, which is usually perceived in its immediacy and requires no interpretation, right? Um, so uh, a metaphor, and this is so important for her reading here. When you see a metaphor like tyranny is like a grist mill, um, uh, the metaphor is immediate. The grist mill, the grinding down of individuality, of freedom into a paste or a putty or whatever it is, um, it immediately uh, takes over and gives you a palpable um, sense of what is true in the metaphor. Um, and it's in this way when you say a mighty fortress is our God. God is like a mighty fortress, and that image we've never seen God, right? But the image of a mighty fortress now stands in for God in a very palpable and direct way. And so the metaphor, as poetic thinking, allows the invisible or God to be experienced with a powerful sense of certainty and the surety of sense perception. And this is both the advantage and the danger of metaphors. And this is where we get to what we read today in chapter 13, in which she's going to obsess over the dangers of metaphors um, and their power, right? So she begins the chapter by saying, um, well, there are the usual way we think in philosophy is through vision, through a kind of use of sight. So, Plato's idea of seeing the true, seeing the sun, the mind's eye. Um, and she says but there are other ways to um, imagine an encounter with the ineffable or the 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 sort of glimpse of intuition of what is true or of God. You could hear, right? So in the Jewish religion, she says God is heard, not seen. Um, Martin Heidegger talks about the call of being, right? The way that being calls us and we obey. And so we could talk about hearing. We could also talk about taste, the way we taste things, which is how Kant describes the sensibility related to judgment in the Critique of Judgment. Um, uh, Taste, she thinks, is idiosyncratic. It's we taste a particular salt or sour thing, um, and it's caught up with the very particular thing we're engaged with. But vision has four advantages, she thinks, that make vision the sort of primary way that thinkers and philosophers approach the ineffable. One is that vision uh, creates a distance, right? When you taste, you're right, you're touching the thing, or sensation, or smell. But vision, you can see from far away, like hearing, but there's a kind of distance of vision, whereas hearing, can be quite impactful on you, and it may be too loud. And so that allows for a kind of objectivity and distance, which she thinks is important for thinking. In addition, vision is contemporaneous. We can see many things at the same time, uh, and we can hold on to that vision and keep an image of it in our head. The third is that vision is free in the sense that I see the object, but I don't need to be seen by it. I can look but not be seen. There's a kind of sovereignty to seeing that is uh, different from the other senses. And fourth, that what seeing allows me to see as an image, I can hold on to and, in this sovereign sense, keep to it, and hold it as an image in my head, over time. And this, I can imagine that this image is unchanging and is eternal, right? Sound changes, tastes change, but the image stays the same. Um, and so she thinks that the vision the is becomes the fundamental way in which we philosophers or thinkers approach thinking the ineffable, that which is what the courage or justice or beauty or truth. And we use metaphors to think that, and the advantage of metaphors is that it allows us to connect our thoughts to the world of appearances, right? That's the advantage. The disadvantage and the danger of metaphorical thinking is that they can be too persuasive, like what I said before. Mighty fortress is a god, and suddenly God is like bricks and stones and mortar, and that brings a particular understanding of God, which of course we've never seen, and it makes us think of God as strong as opposed to flexible or meek. And she says this, in a way, we don't know that God is strong and inflexible and can crumble. We but because we have this image of mighty fortress as a God, that's how we begin to think of God. Um, she says this you could see this danger in all sorts of what she calls pseudosciences. Um, Now, everything has a pseudoscience. Every science has a pseudoscientific element to it. So um, there's the science of logic, but there's the pseudoscience of dialectic. Um, in the pseudoscience of dialectic, the idea is that simply by a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, we get to some sort of truth. And she thinks this Marxist pseudoscience of dialectic, material dialectics, is a pseudoscience. Similarly, there's a pseudoscience of psychology, in which we talk about how the consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg, and under the water is the big, huge, slabs of ice that are unseen but are the unconscious. And she says that now this can't be proven. We don't know that beneath our what we consciously have, there's actually an enormous realm of unconscious thoughts. Uh, because as soon as one of those supposedly unconscious thoughts, comes up to the surface and comes up to the peak of the iceberg, um, it has become conscious and lost any connection to unconsciousness. We don't actually know how thoughts become conscious. But she says the evidence of this iceberg metaphor is overwhelming. We don't need facts, or you don't need to prove it. You just need to have the metaphor. And suddenly we think, oh, most of our brain is unconscious, and and consciousness is just a tiny part. And you can imagine how, and you see how this leads to all sorts of crazy pseudosciences today, where people think that much of our need or job is to access the unconscious, and we take drugs or we do meditation or we do this to access the unconscious. I'm not saying those things aren't useful. They may be, but they're based to a certain degree on a metaphorical understanding of consciousness and unconsciousness that is not proven. It's just a metaphor. Um, and so the power of metaphors is that they actually become too persuasive, and they turn us to thinking that uh there's a true connection between the ineffable and the real that's connected through metaphors. um and uh and so in philosophy, we see this as well, in that philosophy is the effort in many ways to say the unsayable, to make manifest what is unmanifestable. Um, and yet, in that, how do we take this flash of insight, right? You have this insight into truth, and how do you take that and make it appear in the world? Um, uh, Plato in the seventh letter, which she talks at length about here, talks about forgetfulness. I'm sorry, talks about how writing is dangerous for a number of reasons. One is that as you write things down, you lose your memory, so you become more forgetful. And, remember, Hannah Arendt was someone who loved to memorize and recite poetry. Well, once you write poetry, once you have the books of poetry, you don't need to memorize it so much. And what's the disadvantage of not memorizing it? Well, when you don't have it memorized, you can't just call it up as you walk through the world, right? And as a result, the poetry becomes petrified. You read it in a book, you read it when you're reading poetry, but it doesn't inform your daily practice, right? And she thinks that's a great danger in writing, as did Plato. Um, in addition, since words are silent, they can't talk, they lose the spirit of the sound and the way they're recited. And the third is that they can't be customized to the person you're talking to. You write it, anyone can read it, but when you're talking to a different person, you actually can speak to that person in a way that's important. Um, and so the point that she wants to make here is that insofar as we philosophize and write down our philosophy and try and use metaphors to express the unexpressible, um, we increasingly blur and overcome what she calls this distinction between truth and meaning. We increasingly think that we can somehow catch the truth or the truth of justice. Um, and yet, the whole premise of philosophy, which begins in wonder, is that philosophy is the invisible and the ineffable. Um, and so, the priority of vision in the history of philosophy, which leads to the priority of language and the priority of writing, relates to this confusion between meaning and knowledge. This attempt to grasp at smoke, right, which she talks about, citing Bergson, that meaning always slips away, as Benjamin said, and that meaning is a blitz, as Heidegger says, and as Nietzsche famously said, as soon as you write something down, you've lost the ability to know it. Um, all of this brings her to the question of, okay, well, if metaphor is dangerous to philosophy and yet needed for philosophy, is there a metaphor for philosophy, right? Is there a metaphor that tells us sort of what philosophy is? Um, and her answer is, well, if there is one, which maybe there is, maybe there's not, it's something like that Aristotle's idea that the the life of the mind, thinking, is the breath of life, right? And that, like life as a species, people born, they die, new people are born, they die, it goes on and on. And that the activity, you know, as long as you're breathing, you're alive. As long as you're thinking, you're alive or you're human. Um, and this suggests that the quest for meaning um, is a task or an activity which accompanies man in life and ends in his death. Thinking is like life itself. And she says that's about as good a metaphor for thinking as we can come up with. And so thinking, which is one of these ineffable things, you don't know, it doesn't appear in any particular way, is connected to the world of appearances through this metaphor of thinking is like the breath of life. But she says this is an empty metaphor. It tells us nothing. What does it really tell us about thinking? That it's like the breath of life? That if we stop thinking, we die? But people don't think all the time. And what does that mean? And so she says it really doesn't give us any answers. It's just another flash, another idea. And we can't answer the question, why do we think? And so she says we suppress the question of why, and we simply are going to look at facts. And the facts she's going to look at are what makes us think. And that's what the next chapter will be. All right. I will stop there for now. Uh, there's a lot to unpack in this chapter. Happy to hear what you guys were interested in, as always. And very much look forward uh to the conversation. Remember, you can participate in the conversation in two ways. One, through the always very active chat, which I see already has a lot of activity in it today. Activity is like thinking, so that's good, or I hope it is. Please be respectful and enjoy the conversation. Uh, you can also come down to the react button, click on that, and participate in the conversation that way. Ah, not many takers here. John, you're up.
Thank you. Um, Aaron dissects what we do, how we do it. But what, according to Arendt, um, is man's essence? What's his purpose? What is man's purpose?
Um, what is man's purpose? Well,
And what's his essence? Is it free will? Is it to think? What
so if you remember, I mean, I don't know if this interesting where this comes from, but if you return yourself back to the human condition, right? Um, she says that there is no human nature. Um, there is no you know, man could be different things, and if man lived on the moon, he would be different than he lived on Earth. Um, but she says that earthly man, as he's existed for, you know, X number of thousands of years, has a condition. And so she writes about the human condition, not about human nature. Um, uh, Within the human condition, right? Uh, as man exists on Earth, right? Uh, there is, there are a number of faculties that she thinks are important. Within the Vita Activa, there's, you know, um, laboring, working, and acting. But she says there are plenty of other faculties as well that are important. Um, and one of those is thinking, which she says she's not going to talk about in the human condition for a whole host of reasons, including that, many people don't, think on a regular basis. Um, uh, what is the purpose of man? Um, uh, it's not a question that she generally answers. Um, as close as you can get to it, she does say that the uh that one way to understand um humanity is to be immortal, uh to seek immortality. That was the Greek idea. Um uh she at times I think she has some sympathy to that, but she also thinks that another way to imagine the purpose of man is to um, live and act in a political community with others, which she relates to the idea of immortality, human immortality. Um, and so, if in the origins of totalitarianism, she says that the only truly human right, which distinguishes us as humans, is the right to speak and act as members of a political um, you know, to be alive, she doesn't think is the purpose because there's lots of other things that are alive. Uh, you know, um, to die is not the purpose because lots of other things to die. What distinguishes humans is that we are the one animal that can achieve a kind of divine immortality through acting and speaking in ways that are remembered and immortalized over generations and even millennia. Um, and so I think to a greater or lesser degree, um, she thinks that is uh, the distinguishing characteristic of humans. Some people will be more driven to act and speak in ways that are remembered than others, which is why she doesn't think we're all equal. We all have the ability to do it, but not all of us do it the same. And some people will be more remembered than others in her account. But again, she doesn't really talk about purpose in that way, John. But um, uh, she does. That's about as I would say. If you want to put it in some sort of I think at least phrase that she would accept, it would be that the purpose of humans is to act and speak in a community with others in a way that they are meaningful.
But that opens up the problem of good and evil.
Yeah.
Um,
And as she says, you know, um, as she says, uh, the standard of greatness is not moral, right? There are people who act meaningfully and are remembered who are not moral people. Um, that's true. Uh, she says that very clearly in the human condition.
so does that lead us to our essence is free will?
Not free will, no, but freedom, which she doesn't understand as free will, right? Freedom, which she understands as uh, the ability to act, the faculty of man to act in concert with others, and thus to act and build new communities, new or to act in a political community in a way that is free, uh, is at the very core this ability to start something new, and that what she calls sometimes this ability to birth ourselves against or again into the world of language, is deeply connected to our human capacity to be meaningful. Yeah.
I it seems to me that there's another side to that coin. It's the side that you speak from the positive, and which I agree and I adhere to, or at least attempt. But there are that excuses evil, and
No, John, it doesn't excuse evil. It admits that in a world of human freedom and human meaningfulness, evil is an ever present possibility. That's not the same as excusing it. It's simply understanding and reconciling ourselves to the fact that along with meaning and freedom comes the likelihood and possibility of evil, which of course, um, John Milton and tells you when he says that, that that God says, free I made him so he can stand or fall. I mean, I mean, I don't have to. I'm sure I could give you the Jewish verses to it, and I could give you the Islamic verses to it. But every religion knows that man made free is a man with original sin, or with at least sin as a possibility. Um, that doesn't excuse sin. It doesn't say that means you should sin, but it reconciles us to the fact that sin and evil are part of human life and part of what it means to be human. We're not going to escape that. Arendt is not, I mean, I think it's a very important, insight or thing to remember that Arendt is not a moral thinker, right? She's a political thinker. Big difference. Um, uh, she doesn't, um, she doesn't believe that there is, that the world, the arc of the universe bends towards justice. She doesn't believe in progress. She believes that humans are always free to begin again, and that freedom allows us to act in ways that make us meaningful. And we are born into a world, and that's what we have to do. Um, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't aim for a better world. Of course, I think we should, and she thinks we should. There's no doubt about that. Um, uh, but that doesn't mean that aiming for a better world will make a better world, right? I mean, the road to evil is paved with good intentions. To use a cliche, I don't hate, I don't want to use too many cliches. I can say it in a more less cliched view, citing Mr. Hegel, right? The greatest good always conceals. No, I'm sorry, I had it backwards. The greatest evil always conceals itself as the greatest good. There's the non-cliched version of the road to hell is paved in good intentions. Susan.
So I continue to struggle with this concept on page 121 of the old edition.
Hold on, Susan. Let me.
Okay.
I got too many editions.
Okay.
121. So we're in this chapter 13.
Good. Okay.
How far into it are we?
And
Okay.
it's the paragraph starts, what recommended site, and then she says, for knowledge comes through searching for what we are accustomed to call truth, and the highest ultimate form of cognitive truth is indeed intuition. And I just don't understand. I think women have been negated for millennia for their intuition, and here she is saying it's the highest form of truth. So I don't really understand what truth she's talking about here, and I don't understand how intuition comes into it.
Right. So she's using intuition in a Kantian way here. Right, which is that intuition is the way that sight comes into us and hits us. It's not some sort of it's not feminine intuition, to use your example. Intuition is sense perception of in some sort. It comes in, and so what she's saying is that intuition provides a priority of sight over um over uh a kind of feeling. And so intuition here would not be identified with the feminine in Kant, but in Price the opposite with the masculine. Okay.
And when it's masculine, it's truth. I see.
Well, I mean, I'm using your words there, but yes, I mean what she's saying is that to the extent that we have prioritized sight, we prioritize truth because the claim is that seeing is true, seeing is believing. She where does she cite? She somewhere in this chapter talks about how if you're facing away from the wall and you say the statue of Zeus behind me is painted red, and then I turn around and I say, no, it's not painted red, right? I'm making seeing into the truth. This priority of seeing as truth, which works in the sensible world, right? She thinks doesn't work when you transfer it into the um the ineffable world. And the problem is that metaphors, the danger of metaphors is that they become too powerful. Uh and even the metaphor of sight as the guiding metaphor of philosophy um disorients us because it makes us think that philosophy is concerned with truth and cognition rather than with meaning. Um, and so, um, if you want to use your terms, the masculine, uh, the masculine priority of sight disorients philosophy and diverts it from what it should be concerned with, which is meaning, to what it has been concerned with, which is truth. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Glenn.
Hey, Roger. Thank you. You may have just answered this, but in the Truth and Politics essay back in the book that we read before this, in Between Past and Future, Arendt talks about and uses, I think, memorably metaphor. She's talking about lying and the liar. The liar is an actor by nature. The person of action, she says, who takes advantage of the mysterious faculty of ours to say, and she puts say in italics for some reason, to say the sun is shining when it is raining cats and dogs. I think that use of cats and dogs is pretty charming, but is she saying that the metaphor weavers among us are charmers and liars? And if they are, why does she deal in the cats and dogs metaphor itself?
Well, okay, let me see if I can unpack this.
Yeah, I may not be
Oh,
asking the question that I think I'm asking, but I for I enjoy
so
her style and she
yeah,
uses a metaphor there and
yeah.
a cliche.
So let's start with the metaphor, right? It's raining cats and dogs, right? Obviously, it's not. I mean,
Right.
well, okay. It's raining hard outside. I look outside, it's raining hard outside, and I say it's raining cats and dogs, right? That metaphor, um, obviously it's not raining cats and dogs, but the idea is that the idea of cats and dogs dropping from the sky is disturbing and pounding and dangerous. And so I'm trying to pull that visible sense into my my attempt to explain this thing I've seen, which is a downpour, which unlike anything I've seen before, right? Um, and so that ability to use a metaphor to describe um something, a sensible thing like a downpour, is part of our ability to use language. Now, um, I can also use the metaphor raining cats and dogs to talk about things that are not real, like the fact it's the sun is shining, at which point I'm simply lying, and I have the capacity to lie as a human being. Um, and I can talk, I can say that the triangle is laughing. And she says, that's not a lie. That's just absurd. Right. So you have a metaphor which tries to express a truth that's hard to express, the ferocity of rain. You have a lie, and then you have absurdities like um uh the wall is cats and dogs. Right? What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. It's not a lie. It's just absurdity. Um, all of these things are possible because one of the fundamental faculties of human thinking, or characteristics of human thinking, is that it is free in this radical way
Right.
that she's talking about. Now, in politics, that has certain implications, which is right that we can evade reality and lie. And she says that a good politician has to know when to lie and when not to lie. There may be times when they need to lie. Um, uh, in philosophy, it has advantages and disadvantages the same way, right? The advantage of it is that it allows us to connect these two worlds, the world of our thinking and the world of appearances. The disadvantage is that these metaphors can be so persuasive that they actually stop us from thinking, that they actually mislead us because we take them as true when they're not true. They're simply metaphors. And that's the danger she's expressing. I'm not sure if I answered the question you asked or not, Glenn.
No, I think I wasn't exactly clear about my question, but when I read that, I asterisked it because it reminded me of your vice president talking about, eating cats and dogs in Springfield, Ohio, and whether that was a proper use of, whether that was a lie or whether that was a portal through which you could talk about another issue. And I wonder what Arendt would say about Springfield and the use of that
Yeah. I mean,
figure of speech.
yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I mean, on the one hand, you can simply say it's a lie, right? I mean, he, I mean, there's another one that's coming around the internet these days, right? Where there's this picture of this poor man who was deported, Venezuelan man deported, no, El Salvadoran man deported to this prison in El Salvador because they say he's a member of this gang. I think it's MS-13 or something. And Trump has now, said he had MS-13 put on his hand as a tattoo. Well, these pictures that he's using are photoshopped. And when he's challenging that, he says, no, they're not. They're true. They're pictures, right? So it's clearly a lie, just like it was a lie to say that immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, were eating people's pets. Uh, one could, if one wanted to, say, okay, it's a lie, but it's expressing a kind of ineffable truth, or it's an attempt to do so.
Right.
And insofar as it is, the image becomes a kind of claim of certainty that stops us from thinking. It becomes a kind of pseudoscience in some way. And, it makes it very hard to challenge the lie, because if you challenge the lie and say it's photoshopped or it didn't happen, people say, well, I didn't mean it literally. I meant it, immigrants maybe not eating dogs literally, but they're, creating the disorder. I mean, I think
Right.
that's the work that it's doing. Okay. Jason.
I find her very contemporary. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenn. Jason.
Yeah, I'm focusing in a little bit on where Arendt was discussing other thinkers, particularly like Plato, and their aversion to the written word. And I think I'm understanding largely because the written languages are worldly, that they are, if they're at all understandable, it's because they relate to shared experiences, and if they're shared experiences, then they're worldly. And when they start to approach questions like elements of wonder or the Blitz or hierophany, these much more ephemeral ideas again, that language doesn't take us there, and metaphors that might are predicated on the idea that you'd have to have direct experience. And so the metaphor won't even make sense until you have personal experience with this, the wonder that is being discussed. That it's beyond traditional day-to-day life. And when she discusses it in other situations, like if we are going to become more ethical, it's because we have to actually discuss ethics, and that it is ineffable, right? And these notions can be approached, but the metaphors have the danger then of misdirecting people because they're just too convenient. Is that the general notion that she's saying?
I think there's a lot, in what you're in what she's saying, and there's a number of things you've said. So one is the difference between writing and speaking, right? And then there's the general question of metaphors, whether they're written or spoken. On writing and speaking, she thinks that a number of these philosophers, including Plato and Nietzsche, and Heidegger and many others, worry that writing makes it even harder to express the inevitable. Nietzsche, she quotes him, paragraph beginning, while Plato still held the true arche, or beginning, she says that Nietzsche, who is obviously no Platonist, writes, my philosophy can no longer be communicated, at least not in print, right? Or in Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, one no longer loves one's insight enough when one communicates it. That used to be one of my email, taglines at the bottom. Back in grad school, I apologize. But it's an important point that once you say it, the spirit sort of disappears from it. And that, I mean, and this is something that Heidegger knew very well. I mean, some of you know Heidegger, but for Heidegger, he kept certain of his writings unpublished his whole life because he was afraid that if he published them, they would sort of lose their power, that they became his own private writings. And, eventually in his later work, he starts writing in ways that are sort of crazy, where he writes Sein, which is the word for being, and crosses it out because he wants to, in a sense, express the way that the word is not adequate to what he's saying. And so he's struggling in his writing to write in a way that holds to a kind of orality that refuses to die in the written word. And so the struggle of many of these thinkers, right, to on the one hand write, but on the other hand confront the way in which writing flattens and weakens what one is saying is important, right? And I gave she gives three arguments for this that Plato makes in his seventh letter. One, I gave them earlier, but that one is about memory, and I talked about poetry, and I mean, I think at the end of the last session, someone asked about The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost, and I did a little recitation of Robert Frost. And, memorizing poetry is so meaningful and important because it allows you to bring the poem to your encounter with life here and now, at a moment when it matters. If you're only reading poetry at night while you're half falling asleep in bed or in a chair, that's great. I'm not saying don't do it, but the poetry becomes something you read because you're reading a book of poetry, not something that enchants your life. And so that's one of the problems with writing. But another is, Jason, if I'm talking to you, if I get to know you, I can use examples that will appeal to you. And I can respond to your queries.
Like
And you're
shorthand.
saying, I don't understand it. And so talking allows me to try and get closer to you and express what I'm trying to say. Whereas if I'm writing for anybody, and it's much harder to do that. Yeah.
That's
Is that
good.
okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Burma.
Roger. My point is about what you said about the power of metaphor versus the persuasive. And she goes so far as to not only saying that metaphor is the connection between the ineffable and the real, but on page 120 of the McCarthy edition, the old edition, she is linking metaphor to evidence.
Yeah.
And she's saying,
The self-evidence. Yeah. Okay.
yeah, visible evidence.
Visible evidence. Yeah.
And she's saying, for no discourse, whether dialectical or logical or rhetorical persuasive, can ever match the simple, unquestioned, and unquestionable certainty of visible evidence. And then she says, this is the perfect adequatio rei et intellectus, or the agreement of knowledge with its object. And this is fascinating. I mean, she links the power of metaphor with the visible with evidence and knowledge, and this all in a few sentences or a few pages. So I would be very happy with some clarification of the connection between metaphor, evidence, knowledge.
Yeah. Thanks, Burma. I mean, like you're absolutely right. I mean, on the one hand, she's linking it here in a few pages. On the other hand, she's been talking about it the whole time. But you're absolutely right. Uh, so if you want to link metaphor with visibility, right? Well, the premise of a metaphor is that you try and express an invisible, ineffable idea by uh um uh carrying it over into the apparent world through a metaphor, right? So God is a mighty fortress, right? Or a mighty fortress is my God, right? And the idea is that the ineffable God is now made visible. The connection between visibility and evidence is that the there is nothing more persuasive to us than our senses, right? I can dialectically prove to you through good pseudo dialectic whatever, right, that up is down. And yet when I drop the ball and it goes down, the senses defeat uh dialectic gymnastics. And so you've gone from the ineffable to metaphor to visibility to evidence. And then what she says, the last part is certainty. What she says is that insofar as the visible evidence is the most persuasive kind, it leads us to think that we understand it, that we know the truth, and we think that God is a fortress, or we think that grief is like the winds buffeting the sea, or we think that you know, and so we actually come to believe that uh, tyranny is like a meat grinder that, dissolves, individuals up. And that, and, yeah, tyranny is that. But tyranny is much more complicated than that. There's, I mean, it's obviously something a lot of people are thinking about today, but Arendt is someone who believes you can still live a very human life under tyranny. Um, right? You may not be able to live a political life, but you can still live a private and social life under tyranny. And of course, you can live a political life, but you may have to um, sacrifice yourself, which she thinks is also a human way of living. Um, uh, so um, the point is that, the meat grinder, the mill, you know, it's helpful as a metaphor, but to the extent we now take it as true because it's so convincing, we stop questioning it. Same with the iceberg metaphor, about the consciousness and the unconscious, and so that's the connection.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Um, uh, John.
Hi, Roger. Um, I'm going to come back to a question that I asked a while ago, and it has to do with meaning. Goes back to John Stern's question that began our discussion of the meaning of life. And so that's one understanding of what we intend by meaning. Um, there are many ways of understanding meaning. One of them is the way you answered his question. You understood meaning as purpose. What's the purpose of life? And you answered that to seek immortality, and from Arendt's point of view, to act and speak in such a way within a community that will be remembered, either because it was extraordinarily beneficial or extraordinarily detrimental. Hitler speaks and it destroys a nation. Uh, uh, Arendt speaks and she inspires us, and we will remember that. Um, uh, Obviously, Robert Frost speaks through language and makes an impression on you. So, anyway, there are different ways of understanding meaning, and one is um, uh, when we say, what's the meaning of a word? What we really intend to say is, what does that word refer to? Okay, that takes meaning out of that and makes it a question of reference. Another way of talking about meaning is coherence. So, for example, a laughing triangle or the triangle laughs is incoherent because it's a categorical mistake. There's categorical incoherence. A triangle is not capable of making a sound, and so therefore it can't possibly laugh. So it's a category mistake. Um, there are other uh, ways of understanding meaning. For example, does it affect you emotionally? Um, that is, do you have some kind of feeling um, about it? If you have no feeling about it, it's not meaningful to you, and so on. So there are lots of ways of different ways of thinking about meaning, and uh, I find it difficult to follow Arendt sometimes when she uses meaning in a way that we're supposed to be able to understand it, and then she uses the word meaning in another context, and it refers to something very different. And I think it's giving us a lot of trouble, it's certainly giving me a lot of trouble in understanding what she is saying, because I really appreciate what she's saying. Um, uh, something that we just said about meaning is uh, it's kind of a vivification uh, in discourse. When you're talking with somebody and somebody says something that is meaningful to you, you feel more alive. You feel connected. You feel that the person has expressed in some way an intuition, which is fundamentally ineffable. That's the difference between a concept and an intuition, right? That an intuition is ineffable. All right. So all of these observations that I'm making have to do with what Ogden and Richards call the meaning of meaning, and they had a very limited sense of what meaning is all about. I see at least a half a dozen different ways of understanding that word. Okay, that's all I have to say.
Um, yeah, it's, she says that truth is a difficult word, but meaning is even more difficult.
Yeah.
Uh, and so, there's no doubt that, um, what meaning is going to be, hard to, unpack here. Um, when she says that, uh, the need of reason is not inspired by the quest for truth, but by the quest for meaning, and truth and meaning are not the same.
Yeah.
Um,
What
the
does that
basic
say?
the basic fallacy is to understand meaning on the model of truth. So we know that's not what we have in mind, right? Not adequatio et intellectus rei, not cognition, not some answer. Um, uh, well, what is meaning? Um, and you're right, uh, uh, it's not an easy question to answer. It's not necessarily the question she's trying to answer in this book. She's trying to answer the question of what is thinking, and what she says is thinking is the quest for meaning. Um, and so you might then say, well, that doesn't help me very much. It's pretty empty. What is meaning? And that comes back to her point here that it is pretty empty. Uh, the question of, what is the purpose of thinking is an empty question. She doesn't think you can answer it. And so the next two chapters, right? Chapters 3, which is called What Makes Us Think, and I think chapter 4 is called Where Are We When We Think, are attempts to uh answer the question of, or pursue the question of thinking without, yeah, where are we when we think, pursue the question of thinking without trying to answer it, because answering it would commit the fallacy of confusing meaning with truth. And you can keep asking me, well, what is meaning? Um, and I think there's a lot that I can say and you can say. Um, that um, meaning is what makes us feel not alone in the world. Uh, Meaning is what makes us feel as if life is worthwhile. Uh, I mean, these are just two phrases that I think would be something Arendt would at least accept. Um, Meaning is a sense that my life is worth it, as she says. Um, we 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 sort of have to believe that our lives are worthwhile. Um, uh, and if you're going to push me into more, there's obviously there's religious or ideas of meaning, right? That it could be that I'm meaningful because I'm created in the image of God, or in because some God created me, or something along those lines. There's political expressions of meaning. I'm meaningful because I have the freedom to act in public and be taken seriously by other people, and that makes me meaningful. Um, uh, you know, um, there's even a existentialist or a Sartrean idea of meaning, in that I'm meaning, in that um I can do what I can do something and act in such a way, even if it seems to be meaningless. There's a Heideggerian sense of meaning, right? I'm meaning insofar as I um stand open in the clearing of being and experience being reaching me to me as I reach to it. Um, uh, I think one of the beauties of this is that there are many ways that humans can experience and find meaning in the world. And I mean, meaning could be, you know, the I find meaning in being a parent or in being a husband or a wife. Um, uh, I think what Arendt is telling us is that we only find meaning when we are thinking, because thinking is the quest for meaning.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll stop there because
Roger, and I just want to add something from the text, and I'm using the old text. It's starts at the bottom of page 123 in the old text. The bottom sentence, the activity of thinking, energia in Greek, that has its end in itself is life. The activity of thinking is life. Its inherent law, which only a God can tolerate forever, and this goes over to page 124. Now, man merely now and then, during which time he is God-like, is, quote, unceasing motion, which is motion in a circle. The only movement, that is, that never reaches an end or results in an end product. It seems to me that thinking is an end in itself. It is, she calls it energia. So I think we could simply translate that as it's pure energy. And to engage in thinking is to engage in something that's pure energy rather than having any connection with body. And that is kind of Aristotelian in that it's our telos, it's the human telos. It is what we live for, to become pure energy,
so
which relates to immortality.
John, I mean, most of what you say I think is right, and I agree with. I want to just one or two quick. First of all, when I answered, I think it was John Stern at the very beginning. Um, I don't think Arendt thinks we have a telos, right? We don't have a human nature. We have a human condition. She thinks that it can emerge, that the human condition can change over time. And she's not a teleological thinker. She's a post-metaphysical, post-teleological thinker.
Okay.
That said, she does think that there is a way in which we are conditioned, and as conditioned, there are ways that we've been, but we can change that over time. That's the freedom or natality of man. Uh, uh, Energeia is opposed to dunamis in Aristotle, right? So if dunamis is sort of a kind of potential, energy is the actuality. So the actuality of thinking, the activity of thinking, is life. Uh, um, Now, of course, that's not true, right? You can be alive and not think. And she knows that, and Aristotle knows that. It's a metaphor. And the metaphor is saying that there's something like how breath enlivens a body to say that thinking enlivens uh um human life. And I want to have time to get to Francesca's question. And there was one more question. I don't know if the person who was going to ask the other question left or not, but if they want to come back, they can. But Francesca, you're up.
Hi, Roger. Thank you. I have a question. In the Waldstein edition, page 119, she cites Aristotle's noesis noeseros. And she says thinking is moving in a circle. And so for Aristotle.
Yeah.
And then she speaks about Hegel. It's another kind of circle, is the speculative circle. And at the end, she cites Heidegger, and it's another circle because it's hermeneutical circle. The hermeneutical circle is to understand something, I must already have understood it. So my question is for Aaron, is she agree with thinking is moving in a circle or not? Because when I read the pages, I don't think if she's agree or she's not agree. Thank you, Rogers, to explain it.
Yeah. Thank you, Francesca. So maybe I'll say it this way. I don't think she agrees or disagrees. I don't think I don't think, see, because to, to say agree or disagree would to suggest that it's true or untrue. She doesn't think it's true or untrue that thinking moves in a circle. She thinks that thinkers from Aristotle to Heidegger, right, have tried to express what thinking is, the energeia of thinking, as this is the same passage actually that we were just talking about with John, right? And she's saying, that thinking or the quest for meaning produces no end result, which could survive the activity. It's an end in itself. And so, the delight in thinking is ineffable, right? It doesn't lead to any answers. It doesn't lead to a conclusion. It doesn't complete the circle, to use the metaphor, right? And she says, so the only metaphor that one could imagine for thinking is being alive. It's simply, we love it, not because there's any purpose to it, but because it is, and we like being alive. And she says, without the breath of life, the human body is a corpse. She's unpacking the metaphor here. Without thinking, the human mind is dead, right? Breath to the body, thinking to mind. And then she says this is the same metaphor that Aristotle uses in book Lambda of the Metaphysics. The activity of thinking, the energeia of thinking, is life. And when man is thinking, he is godlike, because he's alive. He's unceasing motion. He's not ending anywhere. He's not dying. He's not achieving anything. He's never stopping. And she's saying that it's this metaphor for thinking that so many of these thinkers have latched onto: Aristotle, Hegel, Heidegger, and others. It's not true, right? It's not something you agree with or not. It's an attempt to illuminate something about thinking, to the extent it becomes too persuasive and we start to think, oh, all thinking is circular, therefore it's useless, right? That would be one way to, you hear this all the time. Oh, that's a circular argument, therefore it's a bad argument. Well, not necessarily. Yeah, a circular argument may be bad, but circular thinking maybe not, because thinking is not an argument. And so she says in the next paragraph, these metaphors, though they correspond to the speculative, non-cognitive way of thinking and remain loyal to the fundamental experiences of the thinking ego, since they relate to no cognitive capacity, remain singularly empty, right? This is the emptiness of these metaphors. There's something meaningful about them, but they don't tell us anything true or untrue. And that's why, I think the question of agreement or not doesn't really make much sense for her. If that's fair. And so she says this metaphor of thinking as life, or the activity of thinking as life, doesn't tell us what the purpose of life is, or thinking. It doesn't tell us why we think, right? And that's the question John Stearns started with today. There is no, these metaphors can't tell us why we think, or what the purpose of thinking is, or what the purpose, therefore, of life is. All they can do, is give us a sense of some ineffable characteristic of thinking, that they want to express to us as meaningful. And they think that it's meaningful to engage in this activity that has no end. And people either have to see that or not, but it's not something that's true or false. Okay, I think that makes sense. Donna, quickly.
Thanks, Roger. It will be just a quick comment, really, for us to think about, since several of us here on the Zoom, I think, speak, read, and write in more than one language. I was just wondering, and I commented in the chat, when you're thinking in other languages, are you still thinking in the way Arendt? Well, I suppose thinking in other languages, you're thinking in the way Arendt's talking about it here. But when you're moving between the two languages, I think that changes, or does it, the nature of thinking? And I guess I leave that more just as a comment to think about, rather than requiring an answer because of time. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, one of the premises of the critical edition, if you, and not in this volume so much because she never finished it and she wrote it mostly in English, but is that Arendt thinks and writes in different languages, and that those different languages matter, and that she thinks differently in German than she does in English, for example. And so in the other editions of the critical edition that are coming out now, everything she writes is printed in both languages that she writes it in, as a way of beginning to raise the question of how she thinks differently in English and in German. And I think, as you begin to read some of her books, which she translated herself, from The Origins, The Human Condition, probably being the two most important ones, but there's some others as well. You really do see that the books are quite different in the different languages, and that they reflect different thought trains that she goes on to through the language. And I think that's an important distinction. So, yes. All right, everyone. Thank you very much. For next week, we start chapter 3 of part 1, which is what makes us think. And we really begin to get into some wonderful, really wonderful readings of the Greeks, Plato, Socrates, and others. These are some of I love these chapters. And so I hope you enjoy them. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you next week. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
Ciao.
you, Roger.
Ciao, ciao, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you.